This is Get Real with Deb Waterbury, a show where Dr. Deb gets real as she teaches through books and studies on topics relevant for today. And now, here is your host, Dr. Deb Waterbury.
Hi there. We are in week 4 of our series called Finding Intimacy with God, Psalm by Psalm. And so far we're in week 4, and every week I've used a psalm that is from David. And pretty much I think this entire series, we stay pretty much with David. David was, as we've talked about, a man after God's own heart. And I need you to hear me, and I've said this before, I need to say it again. That doesn't mean that David had a heart like God's. That doesn't, we sometimes think that that's what it means. It meant that David ran after God's own heart. He was a man after it. He was going after it. And that's where you find intimacy. It's not about what God needs to know about you, because what we've talked about in the last couple of weeks is He already intimately knows you. It's about you going after Him and understanding His heart, because the more we do that, the more we will find that intimate relationship. So this week, I want to talk about trusting God, but trusting Him when times are bad. So the name of this is Trusting God in Troubled Times. And we're going to be looking at just a couple of verses, actually a verse and a half in Psalm 31, though we'll be looking at some of the other verses anyway too, but I want to concentrate on verses 14 and the first part of verse 15. Again, let me tell you, if you have not downloaded the PDFs at debwaterbury.com, please make sure you do that. Just go to the store, and then in store downloadables, and downloadables, you'll just click on the icon that has Finding Intimacy with God. And there you'll find all the PDFs that have the Bible studies that go with each of these weeks. It's important that you do so, because this is all about reflection. This is about you understanding who you are, who God is, what the Bible says about that, so that that relationship you want, and we all, all of us want an intimate relationship with God. Nobody wants to believe and think of God as just this, this separated entity that's literally just out there and not personally invested. We want to know, and the thing is you don't have to just think that God's personally invested in you. He is. He is personally, intimately invested in each of us. We just can't grasp that. So this study is an attempt to get to the place where we can at least a little bit grasp that. So, there are all kinds of different kinds of psalms. There's, praise psalms, and there are psalms about how great God is, about what things He's delivered you from. There are imprecatory psalms, and those are psalms where David, and some of them are not wishing that God would just totally punish their enemies. But there are just as many sorrowful psalms where the psalmist, and Psalm 31 is one of those, where they're just in really dire straits and they're calling out to God. I have taken so much comfort from these psalms during my lifetime, because David in particular understood troubled times. I mean, in Psalm 31, you have to understand what's going on with David right now. He had an entire team of people conspiring to kill him. Those people had slandered him. They'd managed to turn his friends and his family against him. And David furthermore could see that a connection between what was happening right now had to do with the sin he had committed. So it wasn't even like you'd think he was all, Mr. Innocent. He knew, what was happening with Absalom was because of his sin with Bathsheba. So David had to experience, and this was more than most of you and I will ever experience. Many of us will never experience this level of pain and torment and troubled times, where the people that you led were trying to kill you, some of them your family, and that you could look back on it and go, yeah, this is a lot because I sinned greatly. You couldn't even run from that. David is dealing with some serious anguish here. And everything that we're talking about just then all happened in Psalm 31. He talks about all of it in this psalm. It was probably written during the rebellion by his son Absalom, and you can read about that if you ever want to in 2 Samuel chapters 15 to 18. It talks about Absalom rebelling against David. During those months, Absalom led a rebellion against his father, and David's own trusted counselor, Ahithophel, even turned against him. So, he bless his heart. I don't think many of us could relate to that level of betrayal that he felt from his own son. And then his most trusted counselor, the person he trusted most, Ahithophel, went straight against him and followed Absalom. So all these people are turning against him. And in the midst of that, he writes Psalm 31. Now, what I want you to do is look with me, just these verse and a half that I want to talk to you about in Psalm 31 is verses 14 to 15a. And what David says in the midst of this is, "But I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. There's a pastor up in Flagstaff, and he said, his name's Stephen Cole. He said, my response to stress should be a personal trust in a sovereign, personal God. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about, in these verses, some things about what we learn with stress. First off, I want you to realize, and I know you know this, stress is real. It's not, you didn't make it up. It's not that you're a weak person because you're feeling stressed out. Stress is absolutely real. Now, when David says in verse 15 that my times are in God's hands, he's not talking about his, chronological years. He's talking about the ebbs and flow of his life. The good times, the bad times, the in-between times. He's saying all those times are in God's hand. All of the affairs, all the details of my life are in the hands of the Lord. Now, there are a couple of truths I want to share with you about stress. It's real, but there's some things that we can take from what David's done here. Because what David does is he goes from pain, Lord, I'm in such a bad place, and he ends in praise. So I want to talk to you about what David knows, what he does, so that we can do that too, because that's where we have to be in this. First off, the time to prepare for stress, because I'm going to tell you right now, if you're not in it, it's coming. It's before it hits. You don't prepare in the midst of something. You need to prepare before stress comes. Loads of Proverbs chapter 1 verses 20 to 33 talk all about this. Just a couple of those verses, 27 to 31 says, when terror strikes you like a storm and your calamity comes upon like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come over you. And notice the words here, it's not if, when that happens. When distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call upon me, the Lord says, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord, would have none of my counsel and despised all my reproof. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way and have their fill of their own devices. So basically God's saying, they didn't seek me before, didn't seem to want to love me then, didn't love the things I had to say before it happened. So when that distress happens, they're going to seek me and they're not going to find me, because they're right in the middle of the stress, right in the middle of the trouble. You need to get ready for that before that happens. So there's two rules here. If you're in crisis, pray. It's not too late. If you're in crisis, pray. The time is right then. We've all been promised that God will show up. But if you're not in crisis, pray. So it's pretty much, it's the same advice, but the preferable of the two is when you're not in crisis, pray. Praise, speak to the Lord, but get to know Him, so that when you're in those crisis moments, you don't get lost in them thinking that God's not going to be there for you. Because honestly, God will come. And it doesn't mean you're not going to have to live through the consequences of whatever happened, but God will come, and you will be more prepared for that if you seek Him out first. There have been so many times in my life when I wasn't prepared, and there have been just as many where after I was prepared. And the difference in the way my soul rests in God's providential love when I'm prepared for the crisis is night and day from when I'm not prepared. It doesn't mean that God's not there for you, but He wasn't saying in that proverb that He's not going to be there for them, but they're not going to be able to live in the comfort of knowledge they don't have. It's not that God isn't there for you, but you get your comfort from God being there for you because you know He is. It's not about Him not being there. It's not about Him not delivering you. It's not about Him not being God. It's not about whether or not if you don't pray beforehand, He's not going to be there. He's there regardless. But if you don't get to know Him before it happens, He's there, but you don't know it. If you know Him before it happens, He's there and you know it. And so the difference in that is whether you're comforted or not comforted. Do you have peace or no peace? Has nothing to do with God there. Has everything to do with whether or not you know God. So you can't do that in the middle of it. You have to do beforehand. I'm telling you, that's a big deal right there. I think so many people misread that to thinking that if I don't come to God, He won't come to me when I need Him. That's not true at all. God's going to come to you when you need Him. But if you don't know Him beforehand, you won't know He's there. So it really is practical to get to know Him beforehand. The other thing is that even if your stress is a consequence of your own sin, as I said, God's still going to be there for you. It's not that He doesn't. David sees that. In verse 10, if you back up a little bit there, he says, "For my life is spent with sorrow and my years with sighing. My strength fails because of my iniquity, because of my sin, and my bones waste away." David he is in pain. emotional turmoil over his own sin. So he knows this stuff, that he's running from Absalom right now because of his own sin with Bathsheba. He understands that, but he knows at this point still God is going to come for him. His sins are forgiven. Proverbs chapter 28 verse 13 tells us that when we confess our sins, that they are forgiven. Whoever conceals his righteousness will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to reap the consequences of your sin. You can be forgiven, but there are still consequences. Galatians chapter 6 verses 7 through 8 says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that also will he reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life." So David shows here, even so in the midst of this, he knew these were consequences of his sin, but he understood that God was still going to be there for him. And the third thing about stress is that you're not going to get any more than you can handle. And I know that seems like a trite thing, but God's not going to give you so much that you literally explode in pain. That's not going to happen. He trusts you with everything that happens in your life. He's not going to give the amount of stress to you that he would give us to somebody else. It's specifically for you. This is the intimate knowledge of God. Stress is there to grow you. It's either to put the light on the fact that you need some help in some areas in your growth, in your relationship with God, or it's to just grow you to a deeper relationship. Either way, it's there for your benefit. Sometimes, a lot of times, it's, life happens and you're just in the midst of the stress because life is happening. God's still going to use that to grow you. He's never going to let anything happen to you that's going to be more than will be good for you in the end. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, Paul tells us, "God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it." That when you talk about that temptation, it's temptation to give up, temptation to curse God, or temptation to curse someone else in the midst of your trials. God's not going to get you to that place. And there's no time where God leaves you. Joseph is a great example of that. We have that example of all the bad things that happened to Joseph. And yet in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, Joseph comes to the end and says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Joseph knew what we all should know, and that is that God will work it all to good. And God, another thing that we need to know about God and about stress is that God is personal. He's personal and he's in control of all of this. David says that my times, his changing times, are in God's hands. He knows that God is going to take care of all that. God is over everything. I mean, he is sovereign. God is in control. Whether he causes things or allows things, he's still the ultimate controller of things. God doesn't just sit in heaven looking at what's happening in our earth right now today and go, "Oh my gosh, what am I going to do about that?" What I think is really funny, and David wrote this in Psalm chapter 2, verse 4, about God's attitude toward rulers. He says, "He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision." Basically, it's just saying He's not, perplexed or sad or worried about what these people are doing right now. He's just sitting up there going, "Oh my," and when he says holds them in derision, he's just like, they're just little ants, people. He laughs at them because he knows he is ultimately in control here. God is personal also. David exclaimed in verse 14 that "you are my God." The entire flavor of this psalm is personal and it's intimate because David knows that even though God is sovereign, that he's omnipotent, that he's also very personal and he's also intimately knowing him and intimately involved in his life. Sometimes people will accept God's sovereignty and they take that deterministic view of life. Like, that'd be the guy who falls down the steps and stands up and says, "Well, I'm glad that's over with." That's not how God expects us to go through this life. It's basically that David is knowing, and what we need to know is that God is going to take care of you as he is in control of those things. Note what David says in verse 7, "You have seen my affliction, you have known the distress of my soul." So basically, it's the same thing, and then he goes on, and like what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, he cares for you. God knows all this. He knows every single thing, and he cares for you. He's going to take care of you. You have to respond to this in trust. This is we have to respond trusting God in these kinds of times. David says in verse 13, but I trust in you. All this is happening, but I trust in you. And you can only trust in a God that you know. You can't trust in a God that you don't know. This is crucial, and I need you to hear me right now. It's the same principle as, there's a toddler in a pool. Let's say dad's holding a toddler in a pool and he's in the little shallow end. The toddler's fine. He can't touch the bottom, but he's still fine because he knows he's in the shallow end. Daddy's still holding him. Daddy's holding him all the way out to the deep end. Daddy can still stand up, but the toddler starts panicking the deeper the water gets. Now, what sense does that make? Because he would have drowned in the shallow end too. But it's because the knowledge of, oh no, there's more water here, although Daddy was holding him up the whole time and he'd have drowned in any of it. We often look at our life that way. You and I are only held up in this life by God and His merciful hand. So you and I only breathe and move and have our being in the good times and in the bad times because of God. And so if we can just keep our mind wrapped around the fact that that's God all the time. He's either God all the time or He's not God at all. And the more we know of Him, then we're not going to be that toddler who panics in the deep end but's fine in the shallow end, knowing you'd die in either one of them, because He's the one holding you up. He's never going to let you go. But you have to know Him to not respond like the toddler, but to respond like a person who is mature in the knowledge of God. I tell you, at different points in this life, we're all going to feel in one way or another that we're in over our heads. We just always are. You always are. The stress will seem overwhelming and you're going to feel like you're completely out of control. And the truth is that you never were in the first place. For those who know the Lord and are His, we have gladly released that to God. And understand that not being in control, I'll just go ahead and be just, the way things are, because you're not. If you can release the grasp that you think you have on things and allow God to do what He knows is best, stress becomes something that you've thought about before, but it ventures far away from you. It really is knowledge of God. You can't release to a God you don't know. You can't release to a God you don't trust, and you can't trust a God you don't know. So again, it's so much about spending time in His Word, spending time with Him to get to know this amazing God who never leaves you, who never forsakes you, who always holds you in His right hand, period. Always, no matter what's going on, good times, bad times, He's still holding you. When you can get a hold of that, stress is not something that really gets you too often. Again, and you prepare for that before the stress hits. I hope this is practical. It's practical for me. I am an OCD, type A, got to be in control of everything kind of person. And it has taken me a long time to, and I still am not good at it. Please do not get me wrong, but I'm better than I used to be. Prayerfully, I'm not as good as I'm going to be. But at least I'm at the place now where I understand all that control I thought I had, I never have in the first place. The peace I have with sometimes it drives me nuts stepping into the blackness, not knowing where I'm going, but God told me to move forward. But the peace knowing that He's got me, because He had me before too. It's not that He didn't have me, it's just I didn't realize it. Once I recognize that which already is, there is so much comfort and peace in that. And this is practical knowledge for you. God never lets go of you. The difference in the way you respond to that is whether or not you realize it, not whether or not He does it. So important that we grab a hold of that. I love you guys. I pray this is helpful. Looking forward to seeing you next time. Have a great week.
Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Get Real with Deb Waterbury. I hope you were blessed, and I hope you got some information that's going to help you get through your day. If you want any more information on any of my books or my articles or on any of my future speaking engagements, you can find all that information at debwaterbury.com. God bless you.